Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. This podcast is brought to you by Virtual Not Distant, where we help managers and teams transition to an office-optional approach. Find out everything we do over at virtualnotdistant.com and check out our show notes and pictures of our lovely guests over on the podcast page. It's great to have you here, listeners. Let's get on with the show. Hello and welcome to another episode of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast. My name is Pilar Orti. I'm the director of Virtual Not Distant, and you can find out everything we do over at virtualnotdistant.com. And today, I am delighted to finally meet Corine Tan, who's the co-founder of Kona. And we're going to hear about the product that she works on with her team and also about this remote manager report that they gathered together in 2021. I'm always amazed, Corine, by people who just do research because I'm so impatient. But Corine, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to talk about the research that we've been doing. And yeah, thanks. We love Virtual Not Distant.
Wonderful. So before we start, you were telling me while we were talking before we started recording that you and your team are currently in the same physical space, kind of.
Right. So we're recording this in August. So by the time this releases, it's probably not going to be, I'm probably going to be back in LA, but
yes.
We've been remote first since right when the pandemic started, actually, and we all kind of got sent home. And so that was a great excuse as a remote oriented company to practice what we preach. And we've been hiring in the pandemic, hiring completely remotely as well. And so it just felt like the right time to meet up in New York City, where our CEO, Sid, was already located. We were launching on Product Hunt. And so we all gathered out here, flew everybody out, and we've been working in the exact same WeWork for the very first time. It is super jarring, by the way, to have somebody tap your shoulder. As somebody who's so used to Zoom, having some physical touch there is just so jarring. And it's definitely a very different dynamic, given that most of my work experience has been remote up to this point. So very, very exciting, a little distracting, but super, super fun.
I love it. I never thought of that. You're probably like typing away whatever, and then suddenly, what's that?
It's shocking for sure.
So how long are you going to be together for?
I leave this Saturday. It's already Wednesday. So we have little more than like half a week left, which is kind of bittersweet, but it's been super fun. We had to pull an all-nighter. And so for Product Hunt, we were basically awake from, we arrived at the office probably around 9 a.m. and didn't leave WeWork until 6 a.m. And so going through the 4 a.m. kind of surrealism with your team is just such a great bonding experience for sure. There was a lot of singing and shouting and music. So it was very fun.
Well, if you're going to spend time together, you might as well make it like the most memorable experience.
Definitely. There are a lot of musical instruments involved.
Great.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Lovely. Well, thank you for sharing that. So what we'll do, we'll talk about a bit about the report first, and then we'll ask you about the product, also a bit about your team. That would be nice because we've exchanged lots of text-based messages, but we've never talked. So I'm also like, okay, sure. I want to know more. Great. So the first thing, so the Remote Manager Report 2021, with which listeners, if you wanted to download it and have a look while we're talking, and as long as you're not in your cars, you can do that by going to Hey Kona with a K, heykona.com, remote-manager-report. So we'll put the link in the show notes, but just in case you want to have a look at it while we are talking about it. So, Corine, first, can you take us through the context in which the research happened? So who took part, the location, the type of company, etc.?
So I just kind of want to set a pretext of just saying research has always just been part of how we've been doing this startup. The three co-founding team, including myself, we're all UCLA students and now graduates/dropouts. And so we know nothing. We're 21 years old, the three of us. We know nothing about remote work, not nearly as much as we need to be building a product for it. And so we really look to experts and people on the ground to understand the layout of the space as well as what people really needed. since January 2020, when we started doing all this research and even started the company, we have done around 600 interviews to date with remote managers, just constantly having these conversations, asking folks, what do they love? What do they hate? What are they struggling with? For this report in general, it was the 200 manager interviews that we had kind of had the best data around, just documentation wise, and just compiled it all into our 2021 report that we released sometime, I believe, in April. So maybe I might be botching the date.
More or less.
And so more or less. And so that was a huge report. We just compiled all the data points and really had it all laid out in beautiful graphs and such. And at the end of the day, it was 25 pages, which is awesome. I love data, so it was a lot of fun to create. And we just had some really interesting insights. These are all managers. I think oftentimes your remote reports like Buffers, excellent report, et cetera, they're always around just the workers themselves. But we really wanted to understand how company leadership was running companies and what middle managers in particular were thinking.
So we had. Sorry, I was I was already starting to think of my next questions. So, which countries were they based, and how did you approach the managers? And actually, let me just go back a bit, because you've done loads of interviews even before the report, and you say it's what one of the things that's integral to you. How do you find these people? Do you go online? Do you stalk them on LinkedIn?
People are surprisingly friendly. And so LinkedIn is the main kind of medium that we use for reaching out to folks. We sent them a connection request and just explained that we were students trying to learn more about remote work. And all these people were the people generous enough to give their time.
Yeah, nice, lovely. So let's go into some of the stuff you found. Like, what were the managers' main struggles? And let's remember, of course, that this was during the pandemic. So, of course, this is very different context to what we would consider normal, in inverted commas, remote work, or remote work as we knew it, and hopefully as we will know it at some point. What were the main struggles?
Definitely. And I think that's an interesting kind of context to place on, just because the answer they gave was something that didn't necessarily have to do with the pandemic itself. And so their main response was relationship building. All in all, the managers were really struggling with loneliness, isolation, and the ability to connect with teammates, a relationship building. When you look at a manager in particular, it's an interesting kind of thing to bring up, because they're not bringing up burnout. They're not bringing about like time management or even distractions, because we do know that childcare during the pandemic was ridiculous. People did not have any work-life balance whatsoever. But instead, relationship building is the aspect they're bringing up. And it makes sense in a leadership standpoint, because a manager's job is to manage people, not necessarily tasks or OKRs even. It's all about people and enabling teams to do their best work. And that all begins with trust. And so when we started to realize what managers are really being asked to do to build trust in a remote environment, it made complete sense that the pandemic and its like the inability to even have a single in-person meetup like I'm having right now with my team, that really hurt a lot of folks who were not even used to remote to begin with.
Did you find in your conversation, so maybe not in the research, that the fact that maybe emotions were heightened during this time, or the fact that people also didn't have other kinds of social contact with any of the conversations? Do you remember how this affected their replies and what they were feeling? Or actually, it wasn't really mentioned?
It was absolutely brought up at every single conversation. It wasn't necessarily the very first, I guess, business critical problem brought up, but we did dive deeper into it. And over 70% of the folks we talked to were either struggling with mental health issues or burnout as a result of the pandemic. And we created an entire section on burnout inside our report and such. But burnout was unreal in the pandemic. It was hitting crazy levels. And it's literally because we had this crazy collective trauma happening to everybody, where we were removed from life as normal for over, felt like 2 years, even though it was probably more like a year and a half so far.
Yeah. And did you find that that affected how the managers were approaching that relationship building at all?
We heard a lot of joking about kind of them becoming the chief therapist officer, the CTO standing for a therapist instead of technology. And that's, I feel like, capturing the sentiment of it. When you are a manager and folks do not have any work-life balance, you are responsible for making sure that folks are able to have an outlet for a lot of their life aspects. It's impossible to create that separation anymore. And so folks are coming to their managers with the fact that their mother has just passed away, or their kids are creating extra burden. They're not sure if their young child will be able to have the kind of developmental social skills that they need because they were missing an entire year of kindergarten. So it's it's not like we can ignore the fact that we're people anymore. We have to treat each other as humans and be there for each other.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. Yeah, very interesting. Anything else around the struggles or like what their struggles were or anything else around that before we move on?
I definitely want to tap into the fact that even though this is not remote as usual, we were starting to create this entire movement towards just remote. I feel like so many people have always had this strange stigma around remote work. They've been hesitant to take it on. Now that you have an entire world that's been remote for a year and tested it out and realized that it's worked, I think the biggest barrier for folks being remote forever is relationship building and the ability to connect as human beings. And I think once you can solve for that, you can provide the flexibility and all these great, like, you don't lose productivity when you're remote. Folks are realizing that.
Yes.
So if the main barrier is how we can connect as people, finding a solution to that enables an entire remote first future, essentially.
And I won't jump into it now, but that's basically what you're doing and your company, isn't it?
Pretty much.
So
That's our thesis. Yeah.
it's a great problem to be looking at because I think I completely agree. As well as your data, it is the most difficult thing, especially for people who have experienced more of a co-located way of working, either in their current team or in their employment history. That is really the thing that we struggle with most. Good. Okay,
For
so
sure.
we'll come back to that. So I found it interesting that you looked at seniority of the manager and team size. So
Yes.
what was the connection between how managers were struggling, how much, and seniority of the manager and team size?
I think it's important to realize that given the pandemic, a lot of folks weren't necessarily struggling as much as we thought. We did have a bias of interviewing mostly tech companies. And so a lot of them were actually growing rapidly in the pandemic.
Mm.
I believe the number for an average amount of direct reports per manager swelled to about 7, which is crazy. And given that you're hiring during the pandemic, you don't know who these people are because you do know them, you've seen them on Zoom, but you've never seen them in person. And I think there's a whole layer of context missing. And so what we noticed along the seniority lines was that vice or VPs and managers in particular were really struggling. VPs, given that they have a bunch of skip levels, they're basically total direct reports underneath them, including skip levels, probably swells to sometimes 20 to 30 people.
Mhm.
And having to manage that many folks, it's really difficult to know which skip levels are really struggling and where in the department is hurting. I think the level of visibility really goes down. For senior managers themselves, a lot of them were promoted in the pandemic. Some of them didn't have
Oh,
any management experience prior to the pandemic, which is crazy because you're asking somebody to not only do a difficult job, but do a difficult job under the most difficult situation, conditions, I guess, ever. And so what we found was that senior managers are really, really struggling to not only do work as usual, but kind of take care of people and take care of themselves and take care of their families. And suddenly, senior managers, basically middle managers, are super overwhelmed.
mm.
Yeah.
Wow. So you're making me think, I'm completely going off script, but so something that I've been thinking about, because when I was working during the pandemic with teams, some of the teams, they were saying, oh, well, I'm responsible for a team of 20, 70,
Right.
lots of people. And I think even at the level of thinking about relationship building, I think there is something we need to be doing differently, because usually we think about relationship building that I have to have this relationship with all my reports and I have to check in, blah, blah, blah. But when you get to that level and you are away from each other, you've got to start thinking about a web, you being a network, and how you're going to look after that. You can't be thinking, well, personally, I think you can't be thinking about having that such a tight relationship with every single person. So I think that's a challenge as well. Because usually, like you're saying, usually distributed companies, they've worked in a way that maybe the company had lots of people, but the teams were small, because we know that
Right.
in remote, smaller teams, it's easier to manage it. But with the pandemic and in the future, probably some traditional companies have huge teams and it's really difficult to change the mindset. Yeah.
And I think you're touching a really important aspect of when you're remote, unlike an in-person office, larger teams means less trust. And when you have less trust in a remote setting, especially, it's a lot more difficult to communicate when things are wrong or when you notice a problem or when you want to challenge the status quo, let's just say. remote work and when it comes to trying to figure out how to scale relationships, it's not necessarily just the manager and the direct report. It's the direct report and their entire team. That's managing a ton of different relationships and such. And so I think like encouraging something organic in a remote world is super, super difficult. And that's why we're so eager to tackle it as soon as possible.
That's the thing. You cannot leave it to chance, organic. It's really difficult if you do that. You've got to be
For
very
sure.
lucky, I think. Great, good. So we've looked at seniority, team size. You started to touch on the mental health aspect. What else? Is there anything else you want to add around that? What else did you find around that? Or you pretty much touched on a bit, actually.
I will say, like with burnout, it definitely depends on function and such. And I think the majority of the misconception was that burnout was primarily due to Zoom fatigue. But we actually realized that by the time folks reached maybe the middle to end of the pandemic, folks really started to figure out their meeting cadences and stuff. Yes, people were in a lot of meetings, but a lot of folks are actually moving towards asynchronous, deciding that they didn't need a meeting for this or that, or that they could document. And so we're starting to see people actually understanding that remote operates different than an office, which is really exciting because we're following some of the stages of remote transition that GitLab documents. And these are companies that would have never even thought about remote prior. So we're definitely seeing movement there. A lot of the burnout, though, had to do with much more personal issues that people were facing because of, well, a pandemic.
Yeah, I love that you're saying that because I know that there was a lot of problems with meetings and that was making people very tired, obviously. I was even getting tired. I've never had so many video meetings during the pandemic. It's like, what? Can we use the phone? I've gone back to phone. But interesting that you're saying that actually there seems to be a working out in a way that is starting to be worked out. Great to hear. And so finally, oh yes, so great. So you look at the report is great. Listeners, just have a look, download it, have a look. What I really liked as well is at the end you compared what remote might look like in 3 different companies, which is such an important message. People, there's no one way of doing this. There's going to be lots of different ways. And these are some of the ways in which they're different. So can you give us just a sense of, well, just you can tell us about the 3 companies, also why you picked them for your end of report case study, and then how they differ. That'd be nice.
What Pilar is referencing is kind of this page that we have in the report called Culture Building Across Companies. And we just wanted to compare how different companies do remote work. We compared Buffer, Figma, and Asana. These are 3 different tech companies, and we chose them because they represent 3 different, very different sized companies. Buffer is 130, Figma 450, and Asana 1500. So we wanted to just depict how remote work scales and how different companies operate. For Buffer, you have your fully remote first, fully asynchronous, and very proud of that fact company where they wear their values on their sleeve and they're very much iterating constantly on how to reduce meetings, how to make sure that their entirely distributed talent force can operate in a really functional way without necessarily like requiring everybody to be online all the time. And then you see like a Figma, for example, which is moving asynchronous, but they're actually originally based out of San Francisco. And so they started with an actual location-based office, and they're moving towards kind of a hybrid future, trying to figure out how can we hire outside of our headquarters and start to expand there. That's a very different story than Buffer, which started remote first, for example. Then you have your Asana, that's a lot more office-centric, hybrid future, but maybe not so remote all the time. They're definitely trying to figure out how can we have a large scale company that can do both, and where do we draw the line with that? I do want to put in the caveat that these are kind of companies that are ever evolving. And so their remote policies are changing with the pandemic. Nobody really can tell you what the future holds, especially when it comes to remote work and how hybrid will actually work out. Anybody who tells you that they know is lying to you. And so what I can say, though, is what all these companies have in common and what's very clear about a successful remote first strategy, remote in general, remote or hybrid strategy, is that you need to have very set company values and you need to make sure that you're being very intentional with your people. Culture is not something that just happens on its own. It's something that you need to define, iterate, and create, essentially. And so all of these companies list out their company values, and they don't just list them out, they live them. They have tools and processes specifically for creating these values and processes. They really think deep and hard about certain things like meetings, like what are their meeting best practices and where they document them. I think one thing you'll notice across every single remote company that's super successful is transparency. They're always listing different aspects of their handbook and how employees do this or that. And it's just really important to make it abundantly clear to both you, the public, your audience, and your interior company that you know what you're doing and everybody knows what they're doing and why they do it.
Yeah, and especially now that most people actually have had an experience of remote work in inverted commas, and the experience might have been completely different to the one they might have in your organization. So another point. So I think it's a really good list as well, listeners, to just have a look at the things that you need to be thinking around. And it's a really good opportunity to be very explicit about the culture that you want to have, because it's going to change. I think a lot of people were worried about, can we keep our culture? Well, don't you want to look at how it might look? Because it's to try to hold on to some of the values, of course, will be the same, but how those values are expressed will be different. And that's what you've got is quite a good list to just start to think, what kind of things do we want to be thinking about? And one last thing I'll say about this is that I noticed that, and I am such a fan of asynchronous, that Buffer, who's the main async, super async company of those three, they talk about the focus being on reflection, and Figma and Asana talk about speed. Because they're gonna have the offices, they're the ones where and that communication in person can gain that speed. Whereas that if you're distributed, you probably need to slow down a bit, which I think has been a challenge for many companies.
For sure. I'm also realizing this is a podcast, so for audiences listening, I'm nodding vigorously. But yeah, couldn't agree more.
Yeah, great. So with all of that, which gives us such a snapshot, again, as you said, of maybe April, May, early 2021. So great snapshot. So thank you for that. I think it's always very interesting to see, okay, what is going, as you say, mainly tech companies. I seem to remember something around 70% US based, I think. So again, culturally quite specific, but I think you can say that you can generalize as to a lot. That's probably in the case for many organizations. So now I would love to hear about, you've identified this issue. How are you going to solve it? No, that would be terrible to lay it down like that. But tell us a bit. I think it's worth knowing, and you've already started to tell us where you come from and where your company.
Sure.
Yeah. So how did Kona start? And is Kona the name of your product and your company, or only your product? Tell us about that.
So just to clarify, it's the name of the product and the company.
Yes.
And this is kind of a recent shift because before that we were Psych Insights, and it was literally a name that 3 college students came up with. And it's very clear that it was a very college student name.
What was the name again? I missed it.
Psych Insights.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, the important thing is that we're Kona now. So I majored in English at UCLA with the full intention of becoming an author and or maybe like a screenwriter. Obviously, we're not doing that right now. The author still isn't necessarily off the books, but I came into college and my mom was like, you need to do something practical in addition to your major. And so I minored in entrepreneurship, which is probably the least secure of the practical kind of options that you could have chosen.
Oh.
And I really fell in love with it. My parents are both entrepreneurs, and they started a business right when I was born. And so they do staffing and recruiting. And it's very clear that like working for myself was always in plans. But I didn't know what it would take to start a company, let alone just even work in a company, I think. Yeah. And so I was looking into that, and I really wanted to dive a little bit more into tech. So I actually ended up joining something called a hackathon. You just have a bunch of coders in a room for 48 hours with a lot of caffeine. We were organizing it. I was on the organizing team with my now co-founder, Andrew. We were doing marketing together. And when the hackathon ended, when we were kind of recovering from sleep, he reached out to me and said, hey, my friend from my entrepreneurship fraternity, Sid, is starting a company and he needs somebody who can write. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like, let's have a chat. I'm not really interested in doing another job. I'm trying to graduate in 3 years, etc. And I just kind of fell in love with this idea. He really wanted to add a human element to work. That being said, we did a ton of pivots from that initial pitch. But what stuck was the fact that we were just trying to make work a lot more human. And right now, Kona is the emotional wellness platform for remote teams. And so we realize that the reason why a lot of folks are not really able to connect has to do with vulnerability and the ability to be real, be human in a remote environment. When you're in an office and you see somebody that's sad across the room, it's very natural to walk up and ask your teammate, like, hey, how are you feeling? What's going on? And they'll open up to you. In Zoom, in Slack, you don't have that visibility. And oftentimes we kind of isolate ourselves and assume a lot of different things about people instead of actually reaching out. And so we realized that as soon as we can kind of just give folks the avenue to share, even if it's in Slack and even if it's just an emoji, they open up really quickly and they're able to share, hey, I'm feeling super excited, or I'm feeling yellow and really tired. And those little moments are replicating those water cooler conversations that usually happen in an office. And when you start to create a habit of those moments, then you start to realize trust isn't something that requires an office. It just requires a little bit of vulnerability and an openness to help others. And so that's what we're doing with Kona. We're creating a habit out of checking in and being real with your teammates. And we've seen some awesome results around reducing meetings, creating a lot more psychological safety, making folks a lot happier with their jobs and with their teams and closer to their managers. And that's been the biggest reward overall.
And trust doesn't require an office. It's great. You should tattoo that on your forehead.
I always spit out random marketing copy and realize that it's good after the fact. So yes, I'm definitely going to write that down somewhere.
I think that is great. So what is the product then? Just practically, technically, how does it work?
It slots into your existing Slack workspace, and in that, your team channel. So marketing, let's just say, would use Kona with just the other marketing teammates. And they would get prompted every single morning by this dog, by the way. It's named after a friend's Aussie Shepherd. And the dog will ask, like, hey, how are you feeling? And offer you 3 emojis: red, yellow, or green. Green means great, red means terrible. You select one, choose a custom emoji. For example, Medium used red and dumpster fire for a lot of 2020. So you get creative with that and add a lot of context. And basically, it's your life update, your outside of work update for your Slack workspace.
Nice. So it's there. It's in your online office. We call it.
Yes.
It is in your online space. It's in your team space. It's only for your team, so it's private. It's very
Right.
important. And what's the idea behind having a bot asking you? Because I don't know now, but I know before everyone would be like, "Well, I'm not sure about a bot asking me."
Right, right. I think, well, we have the added benefit of making it a dog. This was not intended whatsoever, but folks see a little cute dog and they actually open up a lot more. And so yes, it is a bot, but it's a lot more fuzzy and squishy. And we actually put it on a pillow. So it literally is squishy. But Kona in general, I think it's so interesting, but you would never type into Slack, I'm struggling because my kid had a fever and I'm worried they have COVID. Even though you trust your teammates so much, there's something that prevents us from announcing when we have problems. I think it's the idea that you're seeking pity or that you're asking for attention. And we always discourage that, especially depending on certain countries. I don't know any folks from the UK that would ever put that down ever. And so it's like when you have a dog asking you, and it's kind of, that you're just kind of, it's optional, but you're talking to the dog, even though you're publishing it to your team. That added layer, for some reason, allows folks to open up and be real. And then you're telling Kona what's up, and Kona tells the rest of your team rather than you just announcing it to your entire team. I'm not
Yeah.
sure if that makes sense, but yeah, that is the
Yeah.
reason for the bot in the first place.
Psychologically, it's very interesting, the whole thing, the whole relationship, as you say, because we know that it's our team space. We know it's not Kona who's going to read it. It's it's our fellow people. And there's something, I think, Laila from Mural, we interviewed her. I interviewed her, I think it was maybe 2 years ago. And she found that when in her team, she would ask people, how are you doing in Slack? She wouldn't get as much of a reply, as much of a response as when she introduced a bot to do it. So
Right.
again, it didn't have the fluffiness, but it was just, and I think it's very interesting. I hope somebody is doing, I don't know if is anyone researching into why this might be?
I mean, definitely, maybe not the exact aspect of the bot, but psychological safety completely researched that in a work setting, when you can't be honest and open and vulnerable about something as simple as how you're feeling, that completely affects workplace
Mm,
performance. The problem there is that we address professionalism and we associate professionalism with separating work and life entirely. For the last 50 to 60 years, you are not expected whatsoever, as a matter of fact, discouraged to bring up anything to do with your personal life at work that was seen as unprofessional. And so we're really challenging that stigma and really trying to encourage folks to do it, because when you actually can encourage vulnerability and trust and psychological safety, there's an abundant amount of research that shows that you have the best performing teams with the highest amount of retention, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. So listeners, if anybody knows about if there's anyone looking at this, looking at the effect of using bots and its relationship with psychological safety, with team openness, with everything that Corine is talking about, and whether actually bringing in, for example, a dog into a work conversation starts to bring in a very strong signal that actually we can all be a little bit less rigid and a little bit more fluffy at work. Excellent. Is there anything else, Corine, that you want to tell us about? Anything?
Yeah, actually, the remote manager report is definitely the most data heavy thing that we've released, but we did recently release our team building master guide. Essentially, it's 10 chapters of just all the different aspects you need to know about team building. And while we might associate team building with let's just say Zoom happy hours,
oh no,
it's so much more than that. It's baked into literally every single process from onboarding to exit interview. And so trying to figure out how to do team building, we got you covered, and we'll attach the link inside the description. However you want to do it, Pilar.
Great. Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes, but also, is it accessible from heykona.com?
Yes, it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So you can look for it, and if you type "Hey Kona team building," I'm sure that it will take you straight to the page. Wonderful. Well, yes, that's a really important point, that team building is not an activity; it's a whole process. So anything that can help us. Wonderful. So is heykona.com, of course, is a place that people can find you. Anywhere else that you like to connect with people on?
Yeah, if you want to reach out, it's Corine on Twitter, so feel free to send DM. I'm always happy to collaborate. And yeah, if you'd like to talk about remote work, please fire us an email, Corine@heykona.com. Would love to chat about it.
Excellent. Great. Well, thank you so much, Corine. I loved hearing about what you do. You've been around in the space there, and I was like, okay, it's great. Finally, we get to talk. So thank you very much.
You're too nice. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. You're doing some amazing work, and thank you, audience, for listening.
A big thank you for listening to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast produced by Virtual Not Distant. If you have something to add to the conversation, let us know through the contact form over at virtualnotdistant.com. I have been your host, Pilar Orti, and I'm signing off now. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.